Hello everyone, and welcome to the next installment of my podcast called Let's Talk Horses, where we get to talk about, you guessed it, horses, everything that they contribute to our lives. And every week, I'm so fortunate to have a special guest on with me. I'm going to introduce my guest in just one moment. But before I do that, I'm going to have a little shameless plug for where I am at the moment, because as you notice, my background is a little fancy. It looks a little bit beautiful. So at the moment, I'm spending a week in a beautiful part of Italy called Castelbogone, and I'm at the Castillo di Castelbogone, which is the castle at this town. This castle was purchased by Gary Douglas, I think probably about 6 or 7 years ago now, and restored from pretty much total ruin into this amazing, amazing, amazing space. At the moment, I'm in one of the outbuildings called Casa Camellia, which sits just across from the castle. But wherever you're hearing this podcast, we're going to have a bunch of links and places you can find out about this place, because you can come and stay here. It's a very short drive from the closest city, which is Turin or Torino here in Italy. It's very close to Milan. You can come and spend a couple of nights in absolute luxury, and you can go horse riding, not at the castle, but there's a couple of really cool stables close by that actually me and my guest have ridden at together,
Yeah.
which is very funny. I just thought of that. So good segue. So welcome to my very special guest today, who I work very closely with, actually. Wesley Pullen is a certified facilitator of access consciousness. He's a very, very inaugural part of making this amazing company function and go. He also works very closely with Simone Milicis, one of her right arm people. So thank you so much, Wes. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining me on my podcast.
Thank you for having me. I've been eyeing your
Uh,
podcast out for a couple of months now.
Apparently a lot of people do that. You just kind of create this thing where you get to do something that you love and talk about something you love, and people are like, oh wow, I love hearing the stories and hearing the podcast. So I'm so excited to see what we talk about today, because as I said, we've actually been riding together in the countryside of Italy nonetheless, which is very cool and kind of surreal in a way, because I don't know
Yeah.
about you, and I'm about to ask you how horses came into your life, but as a child, horses were always for me like a little bit of a dream, and especially the thought from a young age that I would one day have the opportunity to ride them through the countryside in Italy was probably never really in my sphere of possibilities. But let's start with that. How did horses come into your life?
So I think I must have been about 6 years old when I first started getting into horse riding. And it was my sister actually who begged my mother for horse riding lessons. And I did whatever my sister did. And I also tagged along with for horse riding lessons. And that dwindled on for a couple of years. But as a child, it wasn't like a huge passion for me, actually. So I think I rode horses for about 4 years then, and then stopped, and later picked it up again as a teenager and fully dived into it with so much passion and love for horses that I didn't quite have when I was a child, actually.
Yep. And it's cool
Yeah.
how that sort of stuff happens, like when you look back on that now, and it's interesting the things we choose to do in order to connect with people, in order to have that thing with your sister, where is she your bigger sister, like your older sister?
Yeah.
Yeah, to have that thing where, you get to have something that the two of you can connect over. But for me, I often see things that we learn from a young age and how much that really lays a foundation for the future. So then when you went back into riding as a teenager, you already sort of had this foundation there. And even though it wasn't a huge thing for you at the time, your body probably started to build up a little bit of muscle memory from it. You got to know the basics of riding, and then when you dived back into it, you already had this like platform. So take us a little bit through what that was like as a teenager. Like, what sort of riding did you do, and how was that sort of like an impact and an influence on your life?
Well, I mean, I'll say it like without exaggeration, but I'm pretty convinced that horses coming into my life as a teenager actually saved my life and changed the trajectory and the path that I was on. Because I was in school, I was an incredibly naughty teenager, and I started getting involved with the really like bad crowds who drank a lot of alcohol and took a lot of drugs. And a couple of friends of mine had mentioned that they were going to go horse riding and start lessons, and I thought, let me go with. And it really started me getting involved into not spending on my afternoons taking drugs, smoking and drinking with my friends. Instead, my afternoons were spent at the stables, grooming the horses, riding, learning, just doing anything and everything I could with horses, even if it was cleaning someone's tack and saddle. So I think horses really changed the trajectory of my life as a teenager, because I started not being so involved with those crowds that were taking drugs, and really just loving the horses.
That's amazing. And do you remember like where, because horses have this way of like just drawing us into their world, and it's almost like, I guess, what this reality would describe as like a bit of an obsession. You start to sort of like think about them a lot. I don't think it's an obsession. I think it's actually the energy that they be and how they sort of how they melt into our worlds, how they impose themselves into our worlds, but in this way that actually creates, as you said, like this totally different future for yourself. So, because I had a very similar teenage years. I wish I'd had the opportunity to get into horses. Well, having said that, looking back on things, it's like I chose the path that you chose, but I didn't have the horses there, so I very much went down that pathway of trying to find myself through, drugs and doing silly things. Well, silly things that you would call silly at the time, but it shaped my life as well. So you've also got to look at, like, if I did have horses then, maybe I wouldn't turn out the way I am now. Like, there's also such a sense in my world. I'm so grateful for all of the choices I made, because it got me here. And, like I started this podcast talking about the fact that we've ridden horses together in Italy. And, if you've been on this podcast for any length of time, I have horses in Australia and Costa Rica, and I have this kind of dream life now. So although as a teenager at the time, a lot of people probably looked at me, and I probably looked at myself a bit like, oh, my future's not looking so bright. I'm enjoying the moment with this like screw the future type mentality. It was like, who gives a shit? I'm just going to enjoy the moment and not care about the future. But for you, do you remember like going to those stables? Because that's a pretty big change to make, to go from that place where you're with these people that are, having a lot of fun, quote unquote, and doing things that, you know, you don't need responsibility. When you're choosing drugs and alcohol, you don't need to be responsible for anything really. Whereas horses, there's a huge level of commitment, responsibility, fitness on your body, like all of these big things. Do you remember what it was that kind of tipped that, or that moment, or can you describe that at all?
It was the euphoria that riding a horse gave me. It was that feeling when you're in the saddle that like you literally can't even put it into words. It's an actual connection between you and the horse that it completely outdoes for me, it completely outdid everything. I was chasing that feeling every time I got on the saddle, every time I put my hand on my horse. I just felt that connection that I never felt before, that felt to me at the time as a teenager like way more fun than going out and partying and doing drugs and doing stuff. I didn't even feel left out anymore, because I knew that I felt more at home with the horses than I did going out drinking and partying with my friends.
That's so cool. Because there's like a realness, like when you describe it, drugs and alcohol to me definitely filled a gap for me, where I was like, I don't know my place in the world, and I really don't know how to handle people. Like I found, school very tough, and my teachers and my family. So I was like, here's this thing that basically just puts this beautiful veil over everything and creates it to be something that it's not, but something that was much easier to handle, where the way you're describing horses, which is very much what I've found now in life, is this realness, like this absolute raw realness that they give you, that is really the polar opposite of what drugs and stuff like that give you. Because with horses, it's this place where you get to find and discover more of yourself. You get to, like, there's so much that comes out of it. So talk to us a little bit, like what sort of riding did you get into? Like what did you explore once you started spending so much time with these amazing animals?
Well, I learned English riding since I was a little child, when Western riding is not very popular in South Africa. So I was very much into show jumping and dressage.
Awesome. And how did you
Yeah,
go? Did you like enter competitions, and did you and your and
I
what did
did.
you ride one horse, or did you have a few horses, or?
Well, I had one horse, and it took me a lot of work to get that one horse. that's a whole other story as well. But yes, I did just ride him, and I did a couple competitions with him, and then eventually competing became too. Um, it took me out of what horse riding really was for me, and then I went back to just happy hacking, jumping, and riding at home. Yeah.
Cool. And what was your horse's name?
His name was horses in South Africa come off the racetrack because he was an off the track
Yep.
thoroughbred rescue
Yep.
with the most bizarre names. But his name was actually Push Beyond the Limits. And I
Cool name.
called him nickname Limit.
Limit. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And, this isn't the longest podcast in the world. We generally just chit chat for maybe like 30 minutes, but I can't help but now want to know the story about how he came into your life, because you kind of brushed over that a little bit there, that it was like, do you feel like talking about that? Is that something
Yeah,
that you
of
can
course.
like give us a little bit? Yay.
Literally, one of my favorite stories ever. I mean, I think I was about 15 at the first met Limit, and he was a new horse at the stable yard that had just recently been put into the riding school for people who used to come for lessons. And I rode him for, I think, the first time just a week after he arrived. And I absolutely fell in love with him from the beginning. And he wasn't even like a pretty horse. He was actually pretty ugly. I know that sounds awful, but he was skinny and he had stomach ulcers and he was in the process of being rehabilitated and all bony and like croup high. Like he looked like shit. It wasn't love at first sight. It was love at first touch, I like to say. And I fell in love with him, and I knew I was going to do whatever it took to have him as my horse. So
Wow.
over the few months, I started riding him and more and more in my lessons. And I begged my mother if we could lease him. So like on a half time. So 3 days a week, he could be my horse. And my mom
Yep.
had eventually said yes to that. And
Wow.
that's when the adventure just started. And I started doing whatever I could to save pennies and start buying tack for him. I used to clean everybody's tack at the stable yard and polish their leather and clean their boots and keep all that money aside so I could buy stuff for my horse. And then eventually, I think it must have been about a year later, I decided to drop out of school, and the money that my parents had set aside for me to pay for my school tuition that year, my dad wanted to keep for me to go to college and study. And my mom said we could use it to buy the horse. And we didn't tell my dad that we used the money to buy the horse. I don't think he knows till this day. But we bought the horse, and that's how he came into my life. Yeah. And I didn't go to college. Yeah.
Oh my God. It's like tears. Like that is like, wow, an amazing story. And I love, like, in Australia, we also have a very big off the track thoroughbred like program as well, because we also have a lot of thoroughbred racing in Australia, and there's a lot of horses that end up in eventing and dressage and jumping that have either raced and had successful racing careers, or they started as racehorses, but it doesn't quite turn out that they're good at it. So this story is probably one that a lot of people can relate to, because I think a lot of people end up with these rescue horses. And I just love that story, to know that, when he came to you, stomach ulcers, like, it's such a common thing in these horses as well, because they live such a full on and stressful beginning of their life, where they don't really have access to just being horses. They have like a very, very controlled and strict training regimen, and it's quite a stressful time. So, like, talk to us a little bit about, like, what was that journey like when, like, it's almost like the healing side of things as well. Like, was there somewhere you noticed that you contributed to his body healing and he contributed to you in that way? Is there anything around that you can recall that you want to talk about a little bit as well?
Yeah, very much. And I developed a connection with this horse that I don't think I've ever had with any other animal so far in my life. And that because he used to colic quite often because of these stomach ulcers. And I would arrive at the stable yard in the morning, and I could see the look in his eyes. And it wasn't even that he hadn't even been fed yet. It wasn't even like a sign of no eating, but I knew that he would colic that day. And
Mhm.
then we would start getting the things in line to help him avoid going to the hospital or something like that. So there was definitely that big connection in a way. And a lot of his healing and development came across from really educating myself about food
Cool.
and nutrition for horses as well. And so that took me down a whole path of educating myself about horses and their food and what this food does and what that food does. And eventually we got him on a full diet of eating oats only. And it's
Yep.
very unconventional choice to feed an off-the-track thoroughbred who's, super racy and gutsy, and putting him on a full diet of oats only and no concentrates completely changed this horse's life. And his stomach healed, and his coat came all shiny. He put on weight, he put on muscle, he stopped colicking. And so it really was that changed his life.
Wow. And because I totally get it about the nutrition rabbit hole as well. Like it's such a,
Oh, it's a
as a
whole,
horse
yeah.
owner, you feel like you're basically just studying constantly about, and so I just want to talk quickly a little bit about that as well, because yeah, like to look at this horse. And so what was it that led you to put him on that diet? Was it something that you read? Was it something like, what was it that actually spoke to you about what his body required?
It was the trial and error, and also
Yep.
looking at his excitement when he actually ate his food. That was
Cool.
a big sign. And looking at, like, because I had dogs at home, and I knew when they didn't like food, they wouldn't dive right into the bowl, even though they eat
Yep.
pretty much the same food like every day. When they were excited to eat their food, they would dive straight in. And so we would try a bunch of different foods with him and a bunch of different concentrates. And concentrates, for those who are listening and don't know what that is like, it's a pellet with a bunch of different grasses and nutrients mixed into one. And he liked a few, but then he would colic, and then he'd stick his nose up to some, and then he wouldn't eat, even if we mixed like some molasses in. And eventually the owner of the stable yard said, should we just try give him oats, like plain oats, and see what he does? And he dove into it like a hoover, just like sucked it all up. And that's when we knew, okay, that's the food he likes. Let's see if it makes him colic. And it did not make him colic.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And I mean, I know probably at the time you were just like this trial and error thing too, but I'd like to think maybe looking back at it, how much you, I don't know, you start to kind of realize as well the way that they talk to us in a way. Like obviously, and again, anyone who's been on this podcast for any length of time, we talk a lot about the energy and the communication that horses are with us, the way that they, show us things, teach us things, guide us through things. But even that, like for him to like, I don't know, put into the stable owner's head or to keep with you guys through this trial period with himself to like really lead you guys down the path of what his body required, and to see. So were there any other instances with Limit during your time together where you can remember him like guiding you and showing you things in different ways, or just any like fun stories that you have about this horse and what change he created in your world?
Um, Gosh, I think it was when he died. That sounds
Yep.
terrible, but when
No.
I'd been stuck in this area where I didn't want to move, and I didn't want to like go on with my life. I was still working a really shitty job, and I was just starting to pursue becoming a facilitator with Access Consciousness, actually. And
Mm.
but there was this area where I really felt stuck, and I don't want to move forward with certain things because he was so important in my life at the time. And
Yep.
and then one day he had a really bad colic, and he died. But that morning that he died, I swear to God, it felt like he was so present in my world. And I didn't know that anything was wrong yet, but I got a call from the stable yard owner, and the vet was right there and said that they unfortunately had to put him down on the spot. But after that, my life really exploded. And it's so hard to connect these things in a linear way, but my life really did change so much after that point, when it was almost like he had said to me, go be free now.
Yep. Yeah,
Mm,
that's magic. And I mean, not at all. To me, it's like perfectly, like to me, it's like as linear as it can get, and not linear in this world sense, but to me, it's like horses have no point of view about death. Like to them, it's like if they can contribute something through giving up their body and this body in this lifetime, like they just don't have a point of view about it. They're not, and the same as injury. And for him, like when he used to colic a lot, or when a horse hurts themselves, or they colic or something, they don't have this point of view of like, oh, I've done something wrong, or it's like, what awareness can I give the people around me and myself from this? Like, what can I truly
mm,
what can I truly have out of this, and how can I use this to change the world? Like their whole perspective on life is thrival, and it's like, I'll thrive until the day I die, and then it's like, okay, now I'm going. And whatever you believe in and however that looks in your world, it's like they will just go and find another horse body to take over. Like it's like this thing of like, okay, I'm done with that body, on to the next one, on to the next adventure. um
Mm.
I've heard Dane here, who's the co-creator of Access Consciousness, talk a lot. And that story that you told about Limit really reminds me. He had a thoroughbred called Playboy. And, Playboy, Dane started traveling a lot for Access. And so wasn't spending so much time with Playboy. But he got a call from Gary saying, he's really sick, he's going to die. And Dane was like, what? And the vet had been out, his body was riddled with cancer and he was getting on in age. And I don't think Dane could even physically be with him, but he tapped into Playboy energetically and was like, hey, like, I'm sorry. I know I haven't been there for you, present for you and in your world, but if you want to stick around, let's change this. And it was for him as simple as he changed the screensaver on his phone to be a picture of Playboy. So every time he picked his phone up, he would see his horse and he would basically just flow and contribute energy to Playboy's body. And I think Playboy, the vets were like, look, he's got, a couple of months to live. You need to say your goodbyes, kind of thing. And I think he went on to live for another 5 years or something like that. So
Wow.
like this space where they're just so willing to like use themselves, use their bodies, and especially for us being their owner, like a lot of the time we form this bond with them that they really will defy everything in order to be whatever we require them to be. And it's such this selfless thing that I find that horses are for us that is so wonderful and magnificent. And I'm like, we truly don't deserve these creatures, but it's
No.
also like everything that we take from them is so amazing. So now, fast forward, like how long ago was it that he passed away? How many years roughly?
Mm. I think it would be 5 or 6 years ago. Mm.
Yeah. And like, is there, so, 5 or 6 years later, like, are there times in your day or in your life where you still draw on him? Like, there's still a place where he contributes now. And like, is there any way you can talk about that having him in your life for that period of time is still a contribution to you to this day?
So much. I think about him all the time, and one of the ways I really do think about him is when I get anxious. When we used to do like show jumping competitions, I would get incredibly nervous, and it would have such an effect on him as well. And then he would get nervous, and before I used to enter in the ring or whatever we were doing, I would sit there and just close my eyes and just take a deep breath on him, and I would feel him do this. And I don't know if you've ever sat on a horse and you feel them do a big,
Yeah.
their whole body goes "Whoop," and then relaxes. And I still do that to this day, where I just sit and I close my eyes and I picture myself sitting on top of him, and I take a big breath and I let it go. And then I
Yeah.
can move forward like in a place of relaxation. And I think about him
Wow.
all the time when I do that.
Wow. That's amazing. And, I don't know about you guys listening, but even as you were talking about that, like my whole body was like, oh, deep breath. And then you relax. And again, on this podcast, we talk so much because it's not that all of us have the opportunity to be around horses all the time. But I think even if you've spent 5 minutes with one horse in your life at some point, whatever that interaction was in that 5 minutes is now available to you forever. Like it's this place where they become part of you and you become part of them. And it's not even like, for you, you were fortunate enough to form this really strong bond with this one particular horse. But even for us as people in general, whatever horse you've interacted with, and maybe it's a bunch of different horses, maybe it's one horse or something in between that, but once you've been into that energetic world that they exist in, it never goes away. It's there and it's accessible for you whenever you choose to ask for it or to just to have it and to be it. And that's truly one of the big gifts that I see horses are for us, is that they never leave us. They're a true like a true comrade, a true friend, like something as a
Yeah.
whole. Like it's not even necessarily one horse. It's an energy as a whole that can be in our lives and contribute in so many different ways.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah.
amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I mean, a lot of the time I also weave in a little bit about these amazing classes in access consciousness called Conscious Horse, Conscious Rider, which is a specialty class of access. But it's also just these conversations for me. I mean, a lot of the time I love it because the person that comes on as my guest, I perceive how much in their world changes after these podcasts. And now I'm like, oh, maybe Wes will like find a way to be around horses in Melbourne. He lives in the city of
Yeah.
Melbourne in Australia now, which I know is still quite a horsey place. So what would it take for me to see you, interacting with horses? Or, you can also always come and ride my horses up on the Sunshine Coast as well. I still remember to this day our ride through the countryside here in Italy, and
It was incredible.
yeah, like you just
Yeah.
pinch yourself, right? But the way horses are also like, I'm just going to pull you into my world, and if you're somewhere nearby to me, then yeah, I'd love to have your company as you would mine. So thank you so much, Wes. We'll also pop in the show notes how people can get hold of you if they are interested in finding out more about Wesley Pullen. Thank you so much for being my guest. Anything else you want to leave us with? Any last comments or?
One last comment, and I think it's one of the biggest things that horses have taught me in my whole life is the real art of being present, and how just sitting on a horse, if you check out, something's going to happen. I won't say exactly what, because it's never the same thing, but the same thing goes for your own life: is stay present, stay in the moment, be present. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That is wonderful. What a epic closing statement. Thank you so much, Wes. Thank you for being here. Thank you. But truly, I mean, far out. It's like, yeah. Thank you for listening, everyone. We will be back next week with another special guest to talk more about horses and how they have impacted that person's life. But I'm so fortunate and so grateful that, Wesley, I got to hear a bit about your story and your amazing horse. And I'm so grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you next time.